Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, getting ready to start my day. Yes, I got a hook grip on the cup. Hook grip every rep, except on a double overhand. I came across a video that was sent to me the other day. Someone said, hey Jason, there's this guy called Shredded Sports Science who's got like a 300 deadlift who's arguing against you on certain things. He's jumped into this whole thing with partials, with Alpha Destiny and everything. And I know you don't always address smaller channels, but maybe you should this one because he comes across as scientific. Now, this guy very well might have a sports science background, but it's very, very clear to me with the things he's saying that he only has access to theoretical knowledge, that he really has no clue how things work in the real world or how to translate it. And he's actually not even up to speed with the current data. That's kind of the scary part. So he's basically jumping into this conversation saying, hey, as far as these rack pull things go, because specifically he addresses Alpha Destiny and I in the title, and he's saying, and again, he's got people following it. That's the scary part also. There are people who are actually jumping in who are agreeing with him, and what he is essentially spouting is bro science, and I'm going to break down why. Because he's talking about rate coding. And for those who don't understand, rate coding is the set system within your body which determines the order, the sequential order in which you recruit various muscle fiber types. Because yeah, we think of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers, but there are at least 20 subtypes. In other words, you have a whole host of different muscle fibers that have different endurance and force production capabilities. The faster twitch they are, the less endurance they have and the more force they produce, and the other direction going the other way. So obviously you have all the way to your most stamina oriented fibers, and then you have your upper threshold fibers. And he says, understanding how this works can really help you in selecting your training. And I'm like, well, no, actually, I don't think that it really does. Rate coding's interesting. It's stuff that experts need to know, but it's not going to matter a whole lot for the other lifters as long as you understand where you hit upper threshold fibers. And upper threshold fibers are usually around your last 5 reps of a given rep max. In other words, you reach upper threshold fibers starting around rep 6 on a 10 rep max. 11 rep max, even if you only do 10 reps, doesn't count as a 10 rep max. Okay, so we're talking about, again, having access to those upper threshold fibers. And then you'll get people who say, well, what if you've reached failure and then you start losing reps? Isn't that your new max? Well, no, not necessarily, because those upper threshold fibers are exhausted and you're not recruiting them anymore. That's why you can't do as many reps, because they haven't recovered sufficiently to contract again. You're losing upper threshold fibers as far as their ability to contract multiple times. So what ends up happening when you start losing strength on subsequent sets, you've already reached those upper threshold fibers and exhausted them. At least a lot of the ones available to you at that point, because some of them only work through different parts of the range of motion. Just what we're going to get to, because again, muscles are somewhat complex little machines. But he comes in and says, lifting very, very heavy weight is a way to immediately get the upper threshold fibers. Because of the rate coding, sometimes when you're not lifting really heavy weight, it can take multiple reps, or sometimes it can take a lot of reps before you start reaching all the muscle fibers, before you start reaching the upper threshold fibers. So very heavy weight is a way to do that. But then he jumps in and says, so shortening the range of motion dramatically is a way to get much heavier weight and immediately get to those fibers. To which I would look at him and go, are you serious? No, that's not how you get to those fibers at all. As far as getting through the rate coding system and getting all the way to the upper threshold fibers, anytime you grab a weight that is your 5 rep max or heavier, that is a very heavy weight as far as this is concerned. When we say very heavy weight does that's what would determine it. And what people need to understand, that's why I say a 5x5 isn't very heavy weight. Why? Because you can't do 5x5 with your 5 rep max. It's probably your 7 or 8 rep max. Right? And if it's your 7 rep max and you do a 5x5, you've only hit what? The last 5 reps for the last 3. So you end up getting 15 reps out of the entire 5x5 that hit the upper threshold fibers. Okay, that's what's going on there. So, back to his point about the rate coding. So he says lifting a really heavy weight and doing an extreme partial is a way to get to them immediately. Well, you could also get to them immediately using others. Now I'm going to use the deadlift as an example here, not the curl, because people say, well, Jason, why can't you just talk about comparing a 100-pound 1 rep max dumbbell curl, concentration curl, and talk about a 5 rep max on that? Because I hope most of you don't know your 1 rep max on a dumbbell curl, because I don't want to promote people tearing their biceps. We're not going to use that example because you know how people are. Well, Jason says people should know their max on their curl. See what I mean? So let's go with the deadlift. Let's go with an exercise we know that it's traditional and normal to lift heavy. So if you take a deadlift, if your max deadlift is 500 pounds, all right, 5 rep maxes are usually in the ballpark of 85%, right? So in other words, if you want to hit the upper threshold fibers on the first rep on a set, on every single rep, you probably should be hitting approximately 85% of your 1 rep max or more. Well, 85% of 500, 425? Am I close? I've been close enough for government work. All right, 425. So if you walk over to a deadlift bar, anytime you put 425 on or more, if you have a 500 deadlift, guess what? You're reaching the upper threshold fibers immediately on the first rep. So even if you're warming up doing singles, let's say you do a 425, then a 455, then a 475, then a 500, all of those hit the upper threshold fibers, even those ramp ups. Even though you're like, yeah, but I can do 5 reps of 425 if I grind it out. That's not my, how does that count by only doing 1 rep? Because you're now at a heavy enough weight relative to your max, heavy enough weight intensity-wise, that you can reach the upper threshold fibers. So shortening the range of motion to add more weight? No, that just changes your max. So if your 5 rep max is that there, but your 1 rep max is 500, you're reaching the upper threshold fibers of 425 and plus. You don't need to reduce the range of motion to get 800 pounds or 1,000 pounds on. And let's go back to the other point. If your 4-inch range of motion rack pull is 1,000 pounds, you now have to put 850 on to get to the upper threshold fibers. So in other words, 700 pounds on a rack pull for a 500-pound max, guy who deadlifts 500 pounds of the max, and deadlifts 1,000 pounds through a 3-inch range of motion rack pull, like a half dick length range of motion rack pull. It might be 1 for Strap-On Destinies fans. But, these sub-dick length range of motion rack pulls that are being demonstrated and everyone's discussing, all right, you now have to go to 850. So 700 pounds, which is 200 pounds heavier than your full range of motion max, isn't enough intensity now on this lift to reach the upper threshold fibers, even though it's a heavier weight, because you have all that mechanical advantage. Then the problem we get to, you can't recruit all the available muscle fibers when you start shortening ranges of motion. The deadlift, for example, is already a partial on a couple of all the joints involved, really. It's not even a full range of motion exercise as it is. Trimming it down shorter is not the goal. That's why guys like Dr. Mike Israel, guys like me even, are telling you if your goal is hypertrophy off of a deadlift, maybe consider increasing the range of motion. Deficit deadlifts, if you can perform them safely, snatch grip deadlifts, they will recruit more muscle mass. You won't get the same specificity you get with a bigger deadlift because that slightly heavier weight does have some carryover for a little bit of stretching maybe on some of the muscles, but stretch overload is not the best way to develop muscles either or build strength. And there's a threshold to where that no longer is beneficial either. In other words, going from 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds, if 500 is your max, just hanging that extra weight off your traps and other muscles isn't going to give any more stimulating effect by going to 1,000 for a shorter range of motion. It's just not. Because even things like the traps get worked differently by pulling from the bottom up to the top. There is a different pull being put on them and other muscle fibers involved. You're not gaining anything. So that's what he's trying to say is that, it'll just help you get to the upper threshold fibers. And you got to wonder, not only does the guy not understand the application, he doesn't even look at the data. What do studies show? That when you cut the range of motion in half and you train at relative intensities, in other words, you have people do either leg extensions or squats to full range of motion with, say, a 10 rep max, versus the full range of motion versus the 10 rep max with the half range of motion, and they've noted in research that means you have to add weight. Your 10 rep max is a much heavier weight through a half rep, much heavier. When they study it, the people who do the half reps with the same intensity with the heavier weight gain less muscle and they gain less strength. because you are not getting all the available muscle fibers anymore. In other words, reaching failure on a half rep doesn't give you access to the muscle fibers that are only available at different joint angle specificities. You're losing some of the muscles involved. By doing that, by losing some of the fibers available, guess what? You now can no longer recruit all the muscle fibers that are normally be available on that movement pattern through a longer range of motion, because you are leaving some of those fibers completely untrained. So therefore, hitting your 10 rep max to failure on a half rep actually recruits less muscle fibers even with a heavier weight than if you had just done the 10 rep max on the full range of motion on your exercises. The research kind of concludes this, and it's some of the research is more dramatic than we might expect in terms of the strength and muscle mass gains differently. And you guys remember, the only reason some lifters who are raw, and we're not talking about equipped lifting, use heavier weights like that for partials is usually neurological. In other words, they want to get used to feeling 600 pounds in their hands on a deadlift when they or bench press when they bench press 400. It can be used as grip work off of blocks, not pins, off of blocks to load 800 pounds onto a bar so that you can try to do grip work with 800 pounds when normally your max is 600. You guys understand that is for grip training or for just getting used to feeling a heavier weight sitting on top of your back on the deadlift so that it feels lighter later. Like if you start loading 700 pounds onto your back and you're trying to get to a 600 pound squat, it might feel lighter, particularly if you walk it out or just do a short range of motion. It can help you get used to feeling the heavier weight on your back to improve confidence, to get your nervous system used to it. And so some lifters find that useful for hitting maxes later, right? Because you may not be hitting your true competition max in the off season and you haven't gotten used to feeling that weight in your hands or on top of you. That's why they do it. It actually produces less strength and less muscle mass. So this guy, he's trying to apply something in a way that doesn't actually work. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.